Hello again, this is part 3 of how Bach's chorale harmonizations work. We've looked at melodic motion, and now we can look at the counterpoint between voices, specifically our chorale tune from before and its bass line. Number 42 in the Riemenschneider edition, Du Friedensfürst Herr Jesu Christ. And here they are, this time literally on the same page, but with no inner parts just yet. Just soprano and bass. And as I mentioned before, in order to understand the counterpoint between this line and this line, we have to look at the concept of relative motion and at the different types of interval between the voices, the vertical or harmonic intervals. I'm going to start with relative motion, which is how voices move in relation to each other. There are 4 kinds of relative motion. In parallel motion, the voices move in the same direction by the same number of steps. For example, this is a third followed by another third. One third is major and the other is minor, but it doesn't matter. There is a special case. If you get a perfect fifth next to a diminished fifth, they're called unequal fifths. They really don't have quite the same effect as parallel perfect fifths because they sound so different. But this we'll come back to when we look at chords. Similar motion means that the voices move in the same direction, but not by the same number of steps. So the intervals are different. For example, a fifth followed by a third. Oblique motion means that one voice moves either up or down, and the other voice does not move but is either sustained or repeated. And contrary motion means that the voices move in opposite directions, one up, one down. They're either converging towards each other or diverging away from each other, as in this case. Now, what is the point of classifying relative motion? The point is that the different types have a different effect, which is normally discussed in terms of independence, i.e. whether or not the voices seem to be doing their own thing in terms of contour. Voices moving in parallel appear to be temporarily stuck together, doing the same thing. Voices in similar motion are a bit more independent than voices in parallel motion because of the different distance covered by each voice, but they're still not really doing their own thing. And voices in oblique or contrary motion, they seem to be the most independent. They seem to be doing their own thing. So this is medium. Medium independence. Stuck together, somewhat stuck together, loosely stuck together, independent. And in general, the aim of counterpoint is to maintain an impression of independent voices, the impression that they're doing their own thing in terms of contour. And therefore, you should use plenty of contrary and oblique motion whenever possible. But there's no need to avoid parallel and similar motion entirely. In fact, it's preferable to have some parallel and similar motion. But in any case, once you write for 4 voices, it's almost impossible to eliminate motion in the same direction, because there are only 2 directions, up and down. Now let's quickly look at which types of relative motion are used between our soprano and bass lines in chorale 42. First, the soprano goes down and the bass goes up, so it's contrary motion. C for contrary. Then only the bass moves, so it's oblique motion. Then the soprano moves up and the bass moves down, so it's contrary motion. Then it's again contrary motion and contrary motion. And now they both move down by a step, so it's parallel motion. And now the soprano line stays the same, the bass line goes up, so that's oblique motion, and then it's contrary again. And then in between phrases, let's still make a note that it's contrary motion, followed by contrary motion. Quaver in the bass line, so it's oblique motion, only the bass moves, then contrary again. Then we have motion in the same direction, but not by the same number of steps. That's similar motion, oblique here, and contrary here. Up, down. When we repeat, the bass is going to go up, and the soprano stays the same. So that's going to be oblique. And then when we start the second section, the B section, the voices go in contrary motion, then oblique, because only one moves, and then oblique again, because the soprano note is repeated, then oblique again, then similar, similar, contrary, contrary, contrary. And here neither part moves, so there is no relative motion. Similar, contrary, similar, parallel, parallel thirds there. And now the soprano moves and the bass doesn't, so that's oblique, followed by contrary motion across the bar line, parallel, parallel, oblique, and similar. So overall, we can see that this counterpoint is unsurprisingly optimal because it features mainly contrary and oblique motion, with a bit of parallel and similar motion. And so the most important lines in this chorale, the soprano and the bass, are creating a strong impression of independence with respect to their contour. And you should aim for this whenever possible, not least because using a lot of contrary and oblique motion between your outer parts is likely to make it slightly less difficult to add the inner parts. This is because generally we don't want all four parts to go in the same direction together. We normally want contrary motion or oblique motion between at least two voices, so whenever you've already achieved that between the outer parts, you're relatively free in the inner parts. They can go either up or down, whichever is convenient. One more thing to notice here is that whenever both parts leap, which only happens twice, when they both leap at the same time, it's in contrary motion. And this is also generally preferable, although not obligatory, because the leaps seem to balance each other if they're in different directions. And this idea of having leaps preferably in different directions, like so, is all the more important if the voices are close together. For example, if your soprano and alto parts do this, then the note A and the note G are quite close together, so it may sound as if what's really happening is this. In other words, the soprano is becoming the alto. Or these parts could even overlap, meaning that the lower voice goes above the previous note in the upper voice, or vice versa. This is called overlapping. And Bach does this occasionally, but you should probably avoid it, especially for assignment purposes. This is different from crossing parts. Parts cross when they temporarily swap positions so that the higher one becomes the lower one, and vice versa. And this implies contrary motion or possibly oblique motion, whereas overlapping implies similar motion. Incidentally, in some chorales it looks as if the tenor goes below the bass, but that's deceptive. It's normally because bass line is being doubled by an instrument that plays an octave lower, so you can disregard that. Now let's look at vertical intervals. This time there are 3 types to remember, plus one quirky interval that somewhat confusingly is treated 2 different ways. The 3 types are perfect consonances, which are the unison, perfect fifth, and the perfect octave, capital P for perfect, plus compound perfect fifths, double octaves, triple octaves, etc. Imperfect consonances, which are the major and minor thirds and sixths, capital M for major, lowercase m for minor, plus their compound intervals, so tenths, etc. And the dissonances, which are any second, even a major or minor one, any seventh, even a major or minor one, any augmented interval, such as an augmented second, and any diminished interval, such as a diminished fifth. And the quirky interval that has two meanings is the perfect fourth. The perfect fourth is acoustically a perfect interval because it represents a very simple frequency ratio. It's also, remember, a melodic consonance, so don't worry about melodic perfect fourths, but as a vertical interval, when the two notes are heard at the same time, it's treated either as a dissonance or as an imperfect consonance, depending on whether the lowest note is the lower note of the fourth. If the lower note of the perfect fourth is the lowest note in the texture, so from the bass up, whether that's the official bass or anyone else, the perfect fourth is a dissonance. So in two-part counterpoint, it's always dissonant, because there are only two notes. Or if there are any other notes above the fourth, such as an extra third at the top, creating a second inversion chord, it's still dissonant. And then if there's another note below the fourth, such as, again, this A, so that the perfect fourth is not from the bass up, but between upper parts, then it's treated as an imperfect consonance. And we can call it an imperfect consonance because you can have them in parallel. And this is why second inversion chords are a little bit tricky to use. It's because they're dissonant. Now again, we have to think about the distinct character of the different types of interval, because every interval has its own character, but there's also a general effect for perfect consonances, imperfect ones, and dissonances. Otherwise, there'd be no point classifying them like this. And it's easiest to start with dissonance. For composition purposes, a dissonant interval isn't just one that sounds bad necessarily, but it has some tension and it seems to need to resolve. And to resolve means it needs to be followed by a consonance. And in most cases, the resolution means that at least one of the two notes that's dissonant will move by steps so that you get a consonant interval. For example, very often, the top note of your dissonant perfect fourth will move down, and so it's called a resolution. But consonances are the intervals that don't seem to need to resolve. They are so-called stable intervals. And perfect consonances are the most stable and most assertive and conclusive sounding. And they're also the intervals that promote what in music psychology is called tonal fusion. That means that they're so consonant that they can be mistaken for one sound. And this is obviously true of a unison, which is by definition two notes with the same frequency. But it's also true of an octave. When people are playing or singing a tune in octaves, you can not notice that they're doing so. Or when cellos and basses are playing in octaves in an orchestra, you might not notice that they're doing so. And perfect fifths have a similar quality, which you can hear in power chords in rock, although not as strongly as the octave because there are two different pitch classes. Meanwhile, the thirds and sixths are normally described as being slightly more active or mobile than the perfect ones, without really being dissonant. So in two-part music from the Renaissance onwards, a typical distribution of these intervals would be that you get perfect consonances, especially at the end, or for other strategic moments such as the beginning or the end of phrases, and then sometimes hidden away in between. And then you'd get lots of imperfect consonances going through a phrase and some dissonances as well, depending on the style of the piece. So let's take a look again at our chorale counterpoint and see which intervals are used. The first interval from A up to C sharp is a tenth, but I'm going to simplify all the compound intervals to simple intervals because it's a headache to think about tenths and twelfths and things like that. So we'll call this a third. And since there are no accidentals, I can assume that any octaves are going to be perfect and any thirds and sixths are going to be either major or minor and therefore imperfect consonances. Fourths are going to be dissonant no matter whether they're perfect or not, and I have to check any fifths to see if they're perfect or diminished because that's an important difference. So here we go. I've got a third, then a perfect fifth, D up to A, then a sixth, then an octave, then a compound third, then a sixth, another sixth, parallel sixths, then a fifth, but this time it's a diminished fifth, G sharp up to D, then a third, then another third, then a sixth, then another diminished fifth, then a third, then a sixth, now a perfect fifth, and now a third. And then at the beginning of the B section, I've got a perfect fifth, E up to B, then a fourth, which is perfect, but it doesn't make any difference, a third, perfect fifth, third, perfect fifth, third, octave, which is certainly perfect because they're both natural, then a perfect fifth, same perfect fifth, third, perfect fifth, third, third, fourth, sixth, another sixth, and another sixth, perhaps, unfortunately, and then perfect fifth, and to finish, an octave. So sure enough, this counterpoint is quite normal because thirds and sixths are used very pervasively throughout. Perfect ones are used at important moments, such as the first downbeat, the beginning of the second phrase, second section, end of the third phrase, and the very end, a fifth and an octave for the final cadence. Dissonances, not too many. There's a diminished fifth here, a diminished fifth here, a fourth here, and a fourth here. And in each case, we can see that at least one note proceeds onwards by step, so the dissonance resolves. Here, the top note moves down and the bottom note moves up. Here, the bottom note moves up, and so on. Now, the two main technical considerations regarding vertical intervals are 1. How you approach perfect consonances, and 2. Exactly how you resolve dissonances and what are the different types of dissonance. So let's consider those two things one by one. First, the approach of perfect consonances. When we talk about approaching an interval, we're talking about the relative motion from the previous interval, and often also about whether the motion is conjunct or disjunct. For example, this octave is approached in contrary motion by step in both parts. And we can also say that this sixth is quit or left in contrary motion by step. And the main principle here is that we should not approach any perfect consonants in parallel, which is to say we shouldn't have two of the same perfect consonants in a row These are called parallel unisons, parallel fifths, parallel octaves. And we don't do this. Why not? Because the strong tonally fused quality of these consonances, their sheer perfection, if you like, heightens the effect that they're tied together by moving in parallel. And in fact, if you do parallel unisons, or even parallel octaves, you've temporarily given up one line in your composition, and you're just unison doubling or octave doubling the same line, like cellos and double basses in an orchestra, or flutes above the bassoons perhaps. It's the same line in octaves, and that is fine in orchestration, etc., but we won't do that in a chorale. It's no longer two lines, and even parallel fifths have a similar effect as in riffs with power chords in them. And this is also why the leading note is not usually doubled in classical harmony. If I'm in C major, the leading note, if it's really a leading note in a dominant chord, for example, then it's expected to resolve up. And so if you had two leading notes, then they would resolve in parallel. Or if they didn't resolve in parallel, then it would sound slightly odd because one of the notes would noticeably fail to resolve. As it happens, there is a specific way that Bach does use parallel fifths in chorales, which I'll explain later, just for your amusement, but I don't recommend doing that. It's also best to avoid contrary motion or anti-parallel fifths and octaves, like this. From a fifth to a compound fifth, for example, or from an octave to a double octave. Bach uses these very occasionally as well, but again, I wouldn't do so for A-level, for example. Now, there's a very important question to clear up, which is, can you go in similar motion, not parallel to a perfect consonance? For example, can you approach an octave in similar motion, like this? Such an interval, an octave, a fifth, or a unison, is called an exposed octave, or direct or hidden octave or unison or fifth. And the answer is yes, these are okay. In fact, it would usually be impossible to avoid ever approaching any perfect consonants in the same direction, but it's best if one part moves by step, and especially between the outer parts, so especially between the soprano and bass of a chorale. And if it's between the outer parts, it's normally the top line that moves by step. And yet again, Bach occasionally breaks this rule, but he will normally only do so right at the beginning of a chorale, when there's an anacrusis or an upbeat, and he has to repeat the tonic chord. So there are a few chorales that begin like this, with tonic chords in which everybody skips up, and there's an octave, exposed octave, in which both notes are approached by leap. And this is okay right at the beginning because you're launching into the chorale, but otherwise you wouldn't do that. Now let's have another look at chorale 42, the outer parts only, and check how the perfect consonances are approached. And sure enough, this perfect fifth is approached in contrary motion. This one is approached in oblique motion. This one is approached in contrary motion, even though it's between sections. This one in oblique motion, this one in similar motion, but the top line moves by step. This octave is approached in contrary motion, and this perfect fifth is approached in contrary motion. So is this perfect fifth, and this perfect fifth is approached in oblique motion. And then finally, there's an exposed octave at the end, or hidden or direct octave at the end, because this A octave is approached in similar motion, but it doesn't matter because the top line descends by step. And in any case, this is a cadence, so it's the moment where you would most want to settle on an octave in this way. Next, we have to look at dissonance treatment. The main point is that anytime there's a dissonant interval in the texture, it has to be justified in one of a finite number of ways. And the trick is, you have to be able to identify which note is the dissonant one and what type of note it is. The main ones we will look at now are passing notes, neighbour notes, suspensions, and anticipations. And for the moment, I'm excluding dissonant notes that are chord notes, such as sevenths in a seventh chord. The first and most frequently used dissonant note is the passing note. Here are two consonances, an octave and a sixth. And this note, B, is a passing note. A passing note is a note that connects two notes which are both generally consonant by step in the same direction. Consonant notes can also have the function of passing notes, but we'll focus on dissonant ones because they're the ones we have to be able to justify. And the main point is that the melodic continuity created by this conjunct motion means that the dissonant interval is a bit disguised and even adds a bit of flavour. But the motion through the note B creates a seventh, which is dissonant. And then when the top line continues to A, we get a different consonance. So in this case, the relative motion is oblique, oblique. But it won't always be. Here's the same passing note, but now the other part moves at the same time that the passing note resolves. So you get a different consonance from before. So this time there's oblique motion and then contrary motion, but it's still a passing note. And now the other part moves down, so it resolves still the same way, but we have similar motion to a consonance, which is now a compound third. So it doesn't matter too much what the consonance is, but there's one thing you shouldn't do, which is this, because dissonant passing notes don't mitigate parallel octaves. So I've actually still got parallels here, really. So don't do that. Now, normally the passing note passes against a longer sustained note, like these ones, and this makes it easier to spot. And in chorales, the passing note is normally an offbeat quaver, passing against crotchets like this. And if it's on the offbeat, it's called an unaccented passing note, metrically not accented. But the dissonant note that connects two consonant notes in the same direction by step might be on the beat, in which case it's an accented passing note. Now the clash is a bit more noticeable, but it still sounds acceptable and even adds a bit of spice. And it might be that the other part moves not at the same time as the resolution, but at the same time as the passing note, like this. But we can still identify the top note, B, as an accented passing note because it's the one that connects two consonant notes by step. You can also get two passing notes in a row, both dissonant, like these notes, E and F, which are a fourth and a diminished fifth above B. And you could even have a situation like this, which is starting to look a bit confusing, because there are two dissonant intervals in a row, but both parts move by step. So what's going on here? Well, there are again two passing notes, one unaccented and one accented. And we can still say that this is the second passing note because it's the one that resolves by step to a consonance. And in this case, there's no oblique motion at all. The parts move at the same time. So how do we explain the diminished fifth? Well, we can still identify F as the passing note because it's the one that connects two other notes that are consonant by step in the same direction. NB never add passing notes on the way to an exposed octave or fifth or unison, because you'll create parallel octaves. so we don't want to do that. Now let's go back once again to our two-part chorale counterpoint. We can now explain all of these dissonances because they're all passing notes. This offbeat diminished fifth and this offbeat perfect fourth are passing notes, and this crotchet G sharp acts as a passing note between F and A. At least that's in terms of two-part counterpoint, and then when we add the other voices, it'll turn out that the note D is a seventh of a seventh chord, so it's the one that officially has to resolve. But in terms of two-part counterpoint, we can say that the dissonances are all passing notes. So let's go back to our discussion of dissonances. The next kind is the neighbour note, also known as the auxiliary note. This note is also connected by step to a consonant note, but it doesn't connect two different ones by step in the same direction like a passing note. It's either complete or incomplete. A complete neighbour note, like this one, this B, is preceded by and followed by the same consonant note. And this one is on the offbeat, so it's an unaccented, complete, lower neighbour note. This note D is an unaccented, complete upper neighbour note because it goes up from C and then back down to C. Now it's an accented lower neighbour note. And as before, the other voice can move when the neighbour note resolves, meaning that you get a different consonance but the same resolution note. The neighbour note resolves by step to the same consonant note from which it came, if it's a complete neighbour note. This note B is what we call an incomplete neighbour note because it only resolves by step but is approached by a leap. And this is an unaccented incomplete neighbour note because it's on the offbeat. Now it's an accented incomplete neighbour note, also known as an appoggiatura. But these aren't a typical feature of chorales, so best not to use appoggiatura. The échappé or escape note is an unusual incomplete neighbour note. It's really the opposite of an appoggiatura because it's metrically unaccented, and above all because it's approached by step instead of resolving by step. And normally it's approached from below, usually approached with an ascending step from a consonant note, which in this case is an E. Instead of resolving by step, you skip the other way, usually down a third or to the nearest consonant note. And this normally happens in the soprano. The escape note is normally in the soprano voice, so you probably shouldn't add escape notes in your Bach chorale harmony, but you might have to spot one, and they normally happen at a cadence. Another variant of the neighbour note is the double neighbour note. This takes the form of the upper and lower neighbour notes to the same consonant note, resolving effectively together. In this case to the note E. But this isn't terribly characteristic either of chorales, so I would in general say less is more with neighbour notes, and you should use more passing notes than neighbour notes. The suspension is a very important and beautiful type of dissonance. This time the dissonant note isn't an extra note that we've inserted, like a passing note or neighbour note. It's a sustained note that becomes dissonant in relation to another part when you delay its motion, which is always a descending step. For example, here the note C starts off consonant. It's above a C, so the interval is an octave, but it could be any consonant interval. This top note we call the preparation because it's the one that is about to be suspended. Then the other voice that's not doing the suspension moves to a new note, which is sometimes called the agent because it's the note that moves. And agent means someone, or in this case something, that acts. And even though the motion of the lower voice really causes the dissonance, which in this case is a seventh, it's the C at the top that is officially the dissonant note, because it's the one that is going to resolve. The C becomes the suspension because it's being suspended rather than moving immediately. And then the dissonant note C, the suspension, resolves downwards by step to a note that is consonant again, in this case a sixth. This note is the resolution, and it's always a step down from the suspension. In principle, the suspension should be tied, but sometimes the same note is repeated, especially in vocal music where there's a new syllable. It doesn't make any difference to the musical construction. If you removed the suspension, you would just get two consonant intervals with a descending step in at least one of the parts. It's important to know that the suspension is metrically stronger than the resolution. Here I've put the suspension on a beat, it could be any beat of the bar, and the resolution is on the offbeat. But the suspension can be on a strong beat, and the resolution on a weaker beat. And in triple time, you can also have a suspension on the second beat, resolving on the third beat. Here the minim C becomes a suspension on the second beat. For the moment, I'm considering only suspensions in two parts, and later we'll come back to suspensions in the context of four-part chords. In two parts, the resolution should create not just a consonant interval, but an imperfect consonance, a major or minor third or sixth, assuming the agent note doesn't move, or in principle a compound third or sixth if you have an extra octave between the parts. The two suspensions possible in the top part are the 7/6 suspension, which we just looked at, and the 4/3 suspension. In a 4/3 suspension, the vertical interval is a fourth, and when the top voice resolves down, you get a third. In some contexts, the seventh, or indeed the fourth, can also be diminished, like this. This tends to make the effect of the suspension even stronger. If, meanwhile, the suspension is in the lower part, or the bass part, it can only be a 2/3 suspension. The suspension is a second, or compound second, that is a ninth, below the agent note, and when the suspension resolves down, you get a third. The 2/3 suspension is what we call the inversion of the 7/6. It's what you get if you octave transpose the top part of a 7/6 suspension below the other part. It's generally the only lower suspension in two parts, because if you invert a 4/3 suspension, you get two consonances, a perfect fifth and a sixth, unless the fifth is diminished, in which case it normally resolves differently anyway. Notice that if it's the bass note resolving downwards, the interval gets bigger from a second to a third. Now, complicating matters somewhat, the other voice, which provides the agent note, can move at the same moment as the resolution, normally to another consonant note, like this. Why is this suspension wrong?
Because the preparation note F is a fourth above C, and in two parts a fourth is a dissonant vertical interval. The preparation has to be consonant.
Correct. This F is really a syncopated neighbour note. A suspension would be prepared like this, for example. Finally, the anticipation. Like the escape note, this is normally something that occurs in the tune, not something you have to add in the harmony parts of a chorale. It most often occurs at a cadence like this. Here, instead of suspending or sustaining a consonant note across into the next chord so that it becomes dissonant, I anticipate or move early to a note that is about to be consonant, here the tonic note, but isn't yet. And whereas a suspension is metrically accented, an anticipation is normally metrically unaccented, normally on the offbeat, or the last semiquaver. The anticipation brings me to Bach's parallel fifths. Sometimes at a cadence, there will be an anticipation of the tonic in the soprano voice, and Bach will at the same time throw in a passing note in the tenor, a passing seventh, and the result is parallel fifths. However, they aren't very noticeable because the second fifth consists not only of decorative notes, but decorative notes of two different kinds, one anticipation and one passing note. Nonetheless, I personally wouldn't do this in A-level coursework or in an ABRSM exam or anything like that, nor would I do this and pencil in Bach does this. You should consult your teacher about this if you're in that kind of situation. But in any case, there is a safe alternative, which is to make the passing note a semiquaver instead, like this, so it no longer coincides with the anticipation. And now we've covered the main things you have to know about two-part counterpoint for Bach chorale purposes. Now you might want to analyze some other chorales just in terms of the outer parts, the soprano and bass. What are the overall melodic contours like? How much parallel, similar, oblique, and contrary motion is there? When are the perfect consonances used? How many dissonant notes are there? And what kind are they? In the next video, we'll look at the implications of four-part chords. And the general idea is that we really have to consider our four-part harmony as four-part counterpoint. So, see you in the next video.